Before looking at the learning theories in isolation, I want to share another perspective that I have found valuable for thinking about learning processes and therefore the elements of learning that theory should strive to explain. Knud Illeris is a Danish educational psychologist whose work is unfortunately, in my opinion, not well cited outside of Europe. He's produced a conceptual model of learning that he argues is a necessary descriptive framework for theories to explain and educators to use. The model starts by noting that several natural and social science disciplines provide the basic knowledge foundation for studying learning. Learning is also influenced by attributes of the learner, which themselves are also studied by those same scientific disciplines. Things like intelligence, disposition toward learning, including motivation, and changes in approach to learning with age are examples of these internal conditions. Then there are also factors that are external to the individual learner, such as the learning space, whether that be classroom, laboratory, experiential in the field or workplace, or even online. Culture is also important because the beliefs and value system of the learner in sociological context with their community is an important influence on learning. As teachers and trainers, we want to understand the application of the understanding of learning while keeping in mind the situational factors of the teaching and learning experience that may be beyond our control. Those would include the internal and external conditions too. Illeris digs deeper in describing learning itself in terms of three sets of observed phenomena that theory should seek to explain. We'll take a quick look at each of these: structures, types of learning, and barriers to learning. His scheme for describing the structures for learning is best represented graphically. He asserts that all learning implies the integration of two different sets of processes labeled here: an external engagement between the learner and his or her social, cultural, or material environments, and an internal set of psychological processes that are associated with the individual learner. The individual processes involve acquisition and elaboration of knowledge. This includes both the content to be learned and the incentive to learn it. And notice that this construct so far matches up with the functions of the mind that we've discussed previously: cognitive elements on the left and affective and conative elements on the right. The individual processes involve acquisition and elaboration of knowledge. But another double-headed arrow connects the learner with the learning environment, including other learners. Interaction describes the learning processes between the individual and the environment through activity, communication, and cooperation. Illeris points out that many learning theories deal with only one of these two dimensions defined by the double-headed arrows. For instance, as you read this week, you'll see that behaviorism and to a significant extent cognitivism focus on the individual internal learning dimension, while social learning theories focus on the interaction with the external environment. Illeris notes that theories that focus on only one dimension need not be considered wrong or worthless because both processes, acquisition and interaction, can be studied separately. However, it does mean that such theories do not envelop the whole field of learning. Next, Illeris uses these two dimensions marked by the two-headed arrows to define a triangle. The corners of the triangle then define three dimensions in the structure of learning. The content dimension concerns what is learned: knowledge, skills, opinions, attitudes, behaviors, and so forth. Think of it as building the capacity of the learner. Because the learner's objective is to construct meaning and ability to perform in practical life, this dimension can be described as personal functionality. At the other end of the acquisition process, incentive represents the mental energy necessary for the learning to occur. Its ultimate purpose is to provide a mental balance between the value of learning and the commitment to learning, which develops a personal sensitivity to the learning process. The double-headed arrow on the top side of the triangle reminds us that the learning content is driven by the incentives at stake, and the incentives themselves are influenced by the value of the content being learned. The interaction dimension is critical in Illeris's model because he feels that the environment is the typical source of the impulses that initiate learning. That impulse might be transmission of knowledge from a teacher, experiences with materials and places, imitation of what others are doing, active participation in learning with others, and so forth. Whatever those impulses are, interactivity generates personal integration to communities and society and builds the sociality of the learner. Illeris sees the triangle as representing tension between the developing functionality, sensitivity, and integration during any learning activity. Next, Illeris adopts standard types of learning that are well described, especially in cognitive psychology. Cumulative learning is also commonly referred to as rote learning or rote memorization. In cumulative learning, factual inputs are learned in isolation without being considered part of something larger. Cumulative learning is a common outcome of behaviorist learning experiences. Two types of learning relate to purposeful connection of new knowledge with what is already known, to build knowledge networks rather than seeing knowledge as isolated facts. With assimilation, there is an existing pattern of knowledge to which new information is added. When we learn by assimilation, we are able to do more with the knowledge because we are relating ideas to larger context. Assimilative learning only works, however, if the incoming knowledge fits the pattern that already exists. In contrast, sometimes the incoming knowledge does not clearly relate to the existing understanding or pattern of knowledge. This means that a learner cannot immediately relate to or understand the new learning experience. But if the incentive is sufficiently strong to acquire the new information, then the learner accommodates by breaking down the existing mental model or pattern in order to build a new one during the new learning experience. If we think back to our previous consideration of prior knowledge and misconceptions, assimilation and accommodation both represent explicit consideration of prior knowledge. If, however, there are misconceptions, accommodative learning is necessary in order to increase understanding. Assimilation does not correct misconceptions because information that does not fit the expected pattern is either rejected or inappropriately included in some sort of an existing erroneous schema. The fourth type of learning occurs when the incoming learning experiences are so unlike past experience that they cannot readily be accommodated without restructuring patterns in all three learning dimensions. Transformative learning is profound and extensive in its impact on essentially everything in the organization of self, and in many cases even self-identity. Transformative learning requires an extensive knowledge base in order to transform from, so it is more commonly thought of as an element of adult learning rather than child or adolescent learning. As a result, we will dedicate a module to this type of learning later in the course. And Loyal's Professor Patsy Bovary teaches an entire course on the topic. Lastly, and I think very importantly, Illeris characterizes learning by the barriers that inhibit learning. This aspect of learning has become a significant focus in my own work, both as it relates to barriers that college students raise to their own learning and barriers to change of teaching approaches by faculty who I work with in faculty development. There are two types of learning barriers. Defense refers to the barriers that exist before a new learning experience even begins. It can include ambivalence about learning or everyday understandings that are erroneous or incomplete that interfere with new knowledge acquisition, or a rejection of the need to learn that's born from a concern that new learning threatens the learner's identity. This latter condition is known as motivated reasoning, and I see it commonly when working with faculty. For example, when confronted in a professional learning experience with data that show active learning generates greater depth and retention of new learning compared to lecture, veteran lecturers actively reject the data because accepting this fact would mean accepting that they have not been highly effective teachers in the past. That realization then attacks their identity as a teacher, so they put up a defense against learning about other ways to teach. The second barrier to learning is resistance, and this appears during learning. When failing to understand in a new learning environment, or perhaps not recognizing that the failure to learn is related to defensive barriers that the learner erected, the learner pushes back, and that further derails new learning. I give workshops to faculty on some aspects of dealing with defense and resistance among their students, and to other faculty developers on how to recognize and deal with these barriers among faculty who experience barriers in their professional learning. Most learning theorists overlook barriers to learning as being a common component of learning. but I see it as an essential consideration. This is one of the reasons why I'm highly appreciative of Illeris's model. I urge you to keep this schematic in your mind or on screen as you read this week. Ask yourself whether any of the single theories you read about actually succeeds in addressing all aspects of this model. And ask yourself, as a past, current, or future teacher or trainer, what the implications are for your application of the model.